This week our topic was on self-directed learning and transformational learning. And your authors did a pretty good job of taking some pretty complex stuff and putting them into these chapters, which I thought were quite digestible. You had an additional reading and some other resources that kind of got at these couple of concepts. I think most of them you're familiar with, especially self-directed learning. As an online learner, you're constantly probably clicking and wondering and looking up stuff. And as a learner who's just sitting there reading the morning newspaper, I usually engage in some self-directed learning when I come across something I don't understand or don't know much about. So I think that was a pretty familiar chapter. Transformational learning, though, on the other hand, may have been like, is this really different learning? And that's what the question, and the most of the discussion was around inside of week 5's discussion. So while there were only 2 questions, a lot of you waxed on and really got in depth and really reflected deeply on these 2 concepts, primarily in transformational learning. So I want to just take a look at the first 2 questions, or the only 2 questions, and do a pretty brief response as I responded to each of you in the groups. And quite honestly, most of you were together on the same kind of topic. Some of you talked about formal education. There was a group that compared or talked a little bit about project-based learning related to self-directed learning, and were those juxtaposed? They're not really, because sometimes when you're working in project-based learning, you're assigned part of the project. You have to do some self-directed learning to actually execute your part of the project. But with that, there were just some other kinds of comments that I'm going to share with you and add a couple of things on to a couple of the questions that were raised. So in question 1 about France validating self-directed learning experiences to engage and to earn a degree, 60% of you kind of sat on the fence and said, I could see this working out in some way. And then about 40% of you said, well, mostly, but I'm leaning towards no, because I've worked really hard and I've put in the time, and where's the justice in that? And a few others even added on and said, not only is there the time and the hard work, but there's some other kinds of experiences gained in a formal setting that you may not have. I think it was Jonathan mentioning that you could also develop some bad habits from your various experiences. All good things were said about reasons why, or you supported the reasons why you thought maybe you'd lean towards no in some of those respects. I think maybe Jillian went and looked up to see how much it costs. They still do pay some tuition, although their tuition is quite a bit less. USU actually has a policy on this in terms of CLEPing out of a course. Let me get to that really quick. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with these CLEP exams, but you can take CLEP exams and challenge a course, and most universities accept them in some way, shape, or form. And at Utah State, if I can grab hold of that, bring it on over here from this other page. The CLEP tests are that you can challenge, basically challenge a course. Right here. American government, American literature, analyzing, interpreting literature, biology, calculus, chemistry, college algebra, and the list goes on and on and on. I think there's about, I didn't count them, but there might be about 30 or 40 courses here that if you score, here's a minimum score, you will earn this many credits for USU. And so they set up those tests for you to challenge those various courses. I also taught a class once. It was preventive maintenance of farm equipment, and it was pretty early on. It was my first couple of years working at Utah State University as a lecturer, and I had a class of about 30 people in this course, and there were 2 gentlemen who had worked quite a bit in the ag implement business. They had done preventive maintenance. And after the first lecture, it became apparent that they knew a lot about this topic, and quite honestly, it was almost annoyingly so, that I went and I said to the department head at the time, do you mind if I create a test that if they can actually get the same test that I would give to everybody else, if they get this content, let them out of here with a passing grade, because they were kind of almost a pain in the class. That sounded weird, but yes, a pain in the class. And he said, sure, why not? Turned out that the one that really was kind of cocky in class didn't score very well on very basic concepts that should be foundational, thereby validating some of your posts and experiences on this topic, that there could be some bad habits, or you don't know what you don't know. And so there are some ways to do it. There's these CLEP exams. I think it was Michelle that mentioned if I had this and I was in charge of it, I'd have them doing concurrent enrollment. I'd have them doing some experiential kinds of things and doing concurrent enrollment. So there are possibly ways, but they would require some paradigm shifts, and I'm not really seeing that as a priority right now. But just an interesting thing to think about as we look at self-directed learning and what possibly other countries are going to be due to address that. Of course, here in our own country, there's a teacher shortage right now, so we are allowing a variety of folks to come in and be credentialed in teaching with any kind of bachelor's degree. And then over so many years of experience, they could possibly do the ARL, but they don't necessarily have to. The alternative route to licensure to get a certificate, but they don't have to. Several of you are dietitians in here, and you talked about being a registered RD. I actually went and looked. It looked like you didn't have to have a degree, but it would be very difficult to pass the exam without having those kinds of concrete courses. I mean, you'd have to really knuckle down in some self-directed learning. Anyway, I think that's about all I really want to comment on that particular question. Mentoring, apprenticeships, internships, externships. If we had a perfect world and we lumped those together with some type of concurrent enrollment, as a few of you mentioned, I think that would be maybe a better approach. The degree has to show experience. The degrees that you earn don't just show a credential. They show that you have an experience in learning how to learn. You probably aren't going to get out of an undergraduate degree without really figuring out how to study. And I think learning how to learn is just about as important. So it really focuses your self-directed learning. It really makes it so that you're effective in your self-directed learning. You know how to gather resources, organize them, and make meaning from them. And that's probably one of the greatest things that can happen in an academic setting, is that learning to learn. So that will foster that lifelong learning and your engagement in self-directed learning. All right. Question number 2, which dealt with chapter 5 on transformative learning. And I have something out of the text here I was going to share. That was actually opened right here at the beginning. If I pull back up. So in chapter 5, right in the very first part of that chapter, it says, simply define, transformational learning shapes people. They are different afterward in ways both they and others can recognize. And I think I put this in my first slide. In fact, I know I put this in the lecture on this, the overview lecture for this week. But that is the part that really makes a difference. The second part, others can recognize. Transformative or transformational learning, terms used interchangeably in the literature, has become most studied and written about adult learning theory since Knowles proposed andragogy in the 1970s. Think back to chapter 3 when we talked about andragogy and Malcolm Knowles. In fact, and this is the part that's a little bit like, whoa. In fact, transformative learning has replaced andragogy as the dominant educational philosophy of adult education, offering teaching practices grounded in empirical research and supported by sound theoretical assumptions. Perhaps because transformative learning is considered to be a form of learning engaged in by adults, not children, transformative learning has brought a new and exciting identity to the field of adult education. So a couple of concepts in there. The first one is Knowles. I still see him. I was reviewing a paper last week that still is using the Knowles andragogy as a model for the theoretical framework for the research. So it's been around a while, and this is now saying, well, no, maybe it's going to be replaced by transformational learning. The second part here, perhaps because transformative learning is considered to be a form engaged by adults, not by children. When I was assigned to teach this course, another professor said, well, I don't really understand why you're talking about adult education. I don't think it's any different than teaching adolescents or teenagers. I really thought that was not a very well-informed conversation because of the experience. Even in this class, there is a great deal of age range. There's a great deal of experience because of the length of time that you have lived on these topics. And it comes out in the reflective practices that you do. So it's not necessarily a maturity level, although we know there's some developmental psychology issues among adolescents, but it's that body of experience that you can connect the dots between the different concepts. So I think that is one of the reasons why transformative learning theory is probably a little bit getting more popularized as a theoretical way to look at adult learning over Knowles's The 6 Assumptions, which, if I can pull those really quickly here. There we go. The assumptions of adult learners. And this is really what, it's actually a fairly linear way to think about adult learning, But just going back to a person matures, his self-concept moves from that of dependent personality towards self-directed being. An adult accumulates a growing reservoir of experience. The readiness of an adult to learn is closely related to developmental tasks, his or her social role. There's a change in time perspective of people that are mature from a future application of knowledge to the immediacy of application. And then adults are mostly driven by internal motivation rather than external. And then adults need to know the reason for learning something. I don't think that we should discount this as a theory. I think these assumptions are still very solid, but I do think it lends just a little bit of more credibility to the idea of transformational learning as a way that the experiences have perhaps been molded in a very emotional way. And several of you talked about that in your posts, and that's the other part I want to add on here. Let's see. I think it was Carrie that said emotional learning, it's really about how you felt differently during that particular exercise. I went to a workshop once, Project Learning Tree. And the whole lesson was going to be about tree size and reading tree rings for age and that sort of thing. So I was all geared up for that. The overheads will be showing a tree cookie. We're going to be counting the rings. Didn't start that way at all. This educator, an environmental educator, started out with, I want you to close your eyes and think about the first tree that you ever sat under or climbed or built a tree house in. I'm not sure if there were people in there who hadn't had that experience. Perhaps if they grew up in a city that just didn't have, or maybe out on the prairie without very many trees, or maybe on the prairie where a tree was very special. But this educator was connecting to an emotion, how you felt. And then the learning and the going over the tree rings took place. So to me, that's the difference, and that's actually a tip. Sometimes if we want to connect in that way, emotions are very strong, and we want to have some transformation. We might want to think about it, okay, these are my concepts. I'm going to talk about trees and tree rings. How can I really get there? What's the emotional part? I work in agriculture, and as I've mentioned before, we have a lot of issues. And anytime there are ethical or environmental concerns, we often see advocating in emotional ways. I didn't say educating because I think there's a little difference between advocating and educating. Sometimes you can get both done. But oftentimes there's advocating in emotional ways that aren't based on sound science or based on facts or any kind of observation, just emotion. And that's really hard for us to separate, especially with YouTube and the social networking that goes out. I think a few of you commented about this as dietitians, that there's just a lot of misinformation out there, and the people will appeal to them in an emotional way. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. When you're presenting something, you can probably make a big impression if you can connect it to an emotion. And in fact, the more senses, and if I haven't said this already, it's a missed opportunity, I'll say it now. The more senses that we can connect to when we are facilitating a learning experience, doing the teaching, whatever it might be, the more senses we can touch, emotional, physical, visual, auditory, the more likely you're going to be able to hit that nerve, or that trigger, that intrinsic motivation to really get to it, to really get the meaning from those concepts. So more is actually much better in this regard. And when people say, oh, I'll differentiate, I'm going to do this lesson this way, some things just don't lend themselves to those other concepts. But the more types of experiential pieces, the more senses you can touch, including emotion, probably the more gain that you will have. And most of you, or many of you, presented examples of that kind of thing. Reminds me of when I sent my daughter to Mexico to do kind of a service learning. And we have in this class, Ashley went to Honduras and she did a service learning kind of thing. And she talked about that in the post that she had in her group. But it reminds me of this really quick little 30-second clip right here.
What you doing way out here?
Water for lost dog in the Mojave, $2.
I bet your folks are missing you.
Rhinestone collar in Vegas, $40. Meatloaf special in Arizona, $8.
Hey, buddy.
Feeling at home when you're only halfway there, priceless. There are some things money can't buy. For your journey, there's MasterCard.
MasterCard made a fortune, or I think got a lot of folks won over to their card with those types of messages. In fact, from about 2000, I think it was 2007 to 2010, there's probably 15 or 20 of those types of commercials where they have in fact, they're listed all here, where they have all of these commercials related to this what's priceless. So back to my daughter. She gets in the car here in Logan, and they start heading down to Mexico for basically, I think it was about a 5-day experience. It was maybe over spring break, maybe it's 6 days, doesn't matter. So, Mom, to go on this trip, it's going to cost, I think it was $100. I'm like, $100? Okay, fine. Sounds like you're going to have a journey. It'll be great. Called us as she was leaving Texas and said, I won't be able to talk now for a few days because we're going into Mexico and no cell phone, and I'm not buying an international plan for that. Said, fine, trust everything will be okay. 4 days goes by. Day 5, when they're driving home, I get a phone call, and the first words out of her mouth are, I said, how are you? And she said, well, I realized that I am a very spoiled, rich, white girl who should be much more grateful for the things that I have. Transformational learning. The $100, it was priceless for what I had to pay for that experience for her to have a transformation. She never forgot and still describes it. And I'm sure that that's what Ashley's talking about in her post as well. Finally, Michelle had a post in here. She said, I always tell my students, I'll drag it over here. I always tell my students, whoops, got a little carried away, that when they come into my classroom that I'm going to ruin their life. If I do my job correctly, they will not be able to see the world the same at the beginning of the semester, at the end of the semester. I have students applying and seeing what they have learned in this class in their everyday life, and they come to tell me about it. Does transformative learning have to start with a big moment or deeply emotional moment like an aha moment? Can it happen slowly over time? I think probably could answer yes to all of those. I think after you've gone through and read and shared each other's experiences this week, I think that we are realizing that it really does have quite an emotional piece where it's really how we felt in that situation that is triggered. Sometimes when they say a smell is familiar to a memory, or music that you hear brings you back to a moment. I think it's a little bit like that. So it doesn't have to be this massively aha moment, because you can have that in an experiential learning, but it may not be transformative in that you are acting somewhat differently and others notice it at the end. Well, good reflection, everybody. Good posts. That was kind of a lot to have in here. I look forward to seeing what you have next week on the Prezzies as we learn from each other and see and we connect the dots looking at body and spirit learning.